Okay, good morning and afternoon to everyone. Welcome back to the A4 International Symposium on Alternatives Assessment. My name is Kathy Rudissel, and I'm a lead chemist and safer chemical specialist at SRC Incorporated. I'm also part of the A4's Executive Council and Program Committee. We have another great agenda today, and I hope you're as excited as I am to get started. Welcome to our third session on alternative assessment and informed substitution and policy part 1, lessons learned and insights for future policy provisions. In fact, today's agenda will be focused on incorporating AAs into policy. It's on the agenda for the whole day. This is an important issue for the A4, and we're currently convening a discussion group on this topic. Open to all A4 members. This discussion group is a great way to get continued value out of your A4 membership, in addition to events such as a symposium. Before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsors for helping to make this event possible. Their generosity allows us to have this platform where we can meaningfully engage on moving towards safer and sustainable alternatives. So thank you very much for your support. Before we get into the session, just some quick session etiquette. We are asking you to keep your lines muted and your videos off during the presentations. If you have a moment to find your name in the participant list, you can rename your moniker or your avatar, so that way your full name and organization are present. Just right click on your name and you should be able to rename yourself easily. We do suggest speaker view in the Zoom function. It's the best viewing experience. During the Q&A portion of the session is the time when you can engage with us, so you can turn your video on and unmute yourself. We just ask that you raise your hand first. The chat, if audio and video isn't available to you, the chat box is also there and you can post your questions there. The session is being recorded and will be available to A4 members next week and in 2 months to the general public. To raise your hand in Zoom, you can go to or scroll to your bottom function bar. You can access it through the participant list as shown here, or it's also in the reactions section of your functions. We just ask that before, after your comment or your question is completed, that you just lower your hand, so that way it's easier to manage the Q&A. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenters and panelists today. Again, I'm Kathy Rudissel, and I'll be moderating this session this morning. The session will be split into 3 presentations in the first half. And then in the second half, we'll have a panel discussion and audience Q&A where we'll be joined by 2 additional discussants. Our first presenter is Xiaoying Zhou. She is a senior hazardous substance engineer from California Department of Toxic Substances Control. The second presentation will be Holly Davies. She's a senior toxicologist from Washington State Department of Health. And in our third presentation, we'll switch gears to an EU perspective with Dolores Romano. She is an environmental deputy policy manager for chemicals at the European Environment Bureau. And in the second half, we'll be joined by Paul Ashford, Managing Director of Antithesis Collab, to join us for the panel discussion, along with Mark Rossi, Executive Director of Clean Production Action. So without further ado, we'll hand it off to Xiaoying to start us off with the first presentation. Please turn your video on and unmute yourself.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I couldn't see the unmute button.
Oh, yep, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, it's all yours.
Thank you, Cassie, for the introduction, and great to be here. I'm going to talk through California's Safer Consumer Products Program and share some lessons learned from our recent experience to review manufacturers' A report. So first, some disclaimer, and this talk does not represent DTSC's official position. And very quickly about SAP framework here, it's broken down into 4 key segments. The first 2 require DTSC to identify candidate chemicals and specific products that contain one or more of those candidate chemicals and put them into the rulemaking and adopt the regulations. The third phase is for manufacturers to do the regulatory AA. And lastly, the 4th section is what we call regulatory response, which imposes a range of the risk management options. So that's a general SAP framework. There's some uniqueness about SAP AA process. It takes a precautionary approach to place the burden on manufacturers to evaluate safer alternatives to answer 2 key questions. Is it necessary? Is there any safer alternatives? Compared with the other existing AA frameworks, SAP AA mandates the evaluation of all the key AA elements: hazard, exposure, life cycle, and economic impacts, function, and performance. The selection of the alternatives goes beyond chemical-to-chemical substitution, and the comparison covers the whole product system with the life cycle perspective. And finally, SAP AA has a regulatory response process to maximize the use of the AA outcome, especially when a company does not select a safer alternative. We can impose specific actions. SAP AA is a typically 2-stage process. For the first stage AA, companies must submit a preliminary AA report that identifies the requirements of the product, the function of the chemical of concern, a list of the potential alternatives, and do the screening level comparison between the hazard profiles of the alternative chemicals to the chemical of the concern. If we approve the preliminary AA, a company will get into the 2nd stage AA and prepare the final AA report using an in-depth analysis and considering additional factors, including exposure, life cycle, and economic impacts to compare the trade-offs and to reach to a final decision on whether potential alternatives are safer and how to move forward with an implementation plan. So this shows a phased process and timeline after the priority products are listed. It typically takes 2 years to complete a 2-stage AA. Generally, DTSC has 30 to 60 days to review the AA reports, depending on which stage of this process. Instead of a 2-stage AA, a company can also submit a bridged AA when they determine there's no functional acceptable alternatives. They also can submit removal notification if they decide to stop selling the products in California. So this is a snapshot of our current priority product list and the reporting status. For the children's sleeping products and carpet and rugs, by the given notification timeline, we did not receive any priority product notification. That means the manufacturers have removed these chemicals of concern from their products or switched to the COC-free alternatives before the effective date of our regulations. But we received 2 AA reports for the remaining 2 products. And so this shows some details about those 2 AA reports we have received. For methylene chloride paint strippers, 11 manufacturers submitted the priority product notifications covering 53 products, and consortium HSIA representing them to submit a preliminary AA reports. However, the group decided not getting into the 2nd stage AA, mostly because of the US EPA's ban of all the retailer sale of the methylene chloride paint strippers. The companies confirmed removing the remaining products for professional and industrial use from California's market as well. For SPF, there's 16 manufacturers who submitted the PBNs covering about 181 products. ACC coordinated to submit abridged AA reports. But currently, further activities are on hold because of that ongoing lawsuit process. And since this is the first batch of our SAP priority products listing, it's quite a new journey for manufacturers to go through this process. So we have made a lot of outreach efforts to provide guidance, training, and support to assist the companies with the compliance. We released an AA guide back in 2017, aligning with the best available AA practice. We have set up AA templates and online document platform Calciffer to streamline the submission process while protecting the trade secrets of the companies. We have received a lot of the positive feedback from many responsible entities to appreciate those outreach efforts. So here I want to share some lessons learned from a relatively high level. SAPA requires information on large set of the criteria to evaluate safer. Therefore, approach to data and knowledge sharing can have a significant effect on the decision making. A set of the good quality data will improve the reliability of the AA. With our first experience, both AA took the consortium approach to meet regulatory requirements. In this approach, diverse products and brands are covered. It seems a way to share the cost and expertise to conduct AA, and also by using chemistry or formulation to group the alternatives and the products. It helped to make it easier while comparing hundreds of the alternatives and the products altogether. Given the short time frame, both to conduct AA and review AA, communication with the stakeholders play a very important role to share the information and coordinate the AA process. Not only the direct conversation with the manufacturers, the trade associations, the consultants who do the AA is a key to break down the silos and help to understand the rationale and expectations from the both end, but also the public comments we received during the public comment period, for example, for SPF, provided us a lot of useful information and different perspective. So we really appreciate that engagement. Particularly, transparency plays a significant role here. We have some concerns over the lack of the knowledge of the product ingredients, chemical used in the manufacturing process, and the material flow along the supply chain. The transparency and disclosure really help to show the manufacturer's work and understand their value choice, which impact or endpoint is more of a concern, what's their priority to achieve. And finally, the rulemaking and implementation is a long process. Some information we do not have at the beginning of the assessment may become available later. Innovation may emerge along the way. So we encourage seeking the incrementally safer alternatives at the time of the assessment, not safe without harm, as John put it yesterday. Therefore, the scope of and assessment of the alternatives should also be re-evaluated over the time. It's helpful to keep track of any new technology development. There may be safer, better performing, less costly alternatives becoming feasible for certain applications. The challenge we encountered can be put into three aspects. First, the scoping challenge. Although the SAP framework considers a wide range of the alternatives, but due to the business model and different interpretations of the regulations, generally speaking, the scope for the first two AA we have received was limited. Especially the consortium would like to take one-size-fits-all approach to look for one type of the chemistry or one type of the alternative to meet the technical requirements for all the products covered under one AA reports and for the different specific applications. If the potential alternative is not commercially available at the time of assessment, the lack of data and greater uncertainties usually make manufacturers turn away very quickly. And next, the challenge comes from the assessment, the data and methodological gaps on hazard exposure, life cycle, and the external cost analysis, how to address chemical mixtures, how to evaluate chemicals as a class as opposed to chemical by chemical comparison, how to integrate those different AA elements to inform decision making. And finally, the challenge in the adoption and the implementation phase, how to use the AA to inform substitution, how to find the most effective approach to adopt safer alternatives and motivate the continuous improvements, how to avoid regrettable substitution ahead of the regulatory AA. So there's many more complex factors needed to be addressed during the implementation phase to handle those uncertainties and the risks. So hopefully some of our lessons learned can shed some light on the challenges and possible future improvements by this broader AA community. There's a need to develop and share data of the product ingredients, material flow along the life cycle, safer alternative selections through something like information exchange platforms and clearinghouse functions. We believe transparency is the first step to build up the best AA practice. Research efforts are also needed to further address the data and method gaps on different AA key elements. We need to develop more concrete guidance on functional substitution, predictive toxicology, comparative exposure assessment and decision making. And also think about apply 3 bottom lines of the sustainability triangle: people, planet, and profit under a big umbrella of the green chemistry and the circular economy, or flip the side to make the AA be part of the bigger toolbox to complement other assessment tools, not leave any blind spot behind. We also think diverse technical expertise and stakeholder engagement is a key for a solid and robust AA. We need work more on the capacity building and the multidisciplinary collaborations to obtain the right skill set. And finally, like the picture shows here, how to capture and measure the shadow evaluation of the impacts of the A-related policies is a challenge. Monitoring the full implementation of the alternatives will help ensure it meets the goal of the policy. So at the end of the day, we want to use AA to change the demand side systematically and use it as a tool to shift the needle towards a safer environment. So next year, we expect to have 3 more priority products listed and receive more AAs. We always welcome your insights and inputs. We just start to launch at the SAP partner recognition list to recognize those who voluntarily provide information to help adopt the safer alternatives. So you can always submit comments and reach out direct to us. Thank you. And also look forward to the more conversations today.
Great, thank you so much, Xiaoying. We'll move on to our next presentation from Holly Davies. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat, or you can hold them until our Q&A session at the end of it, towards the later half of our session.
Hi, I'm Holly Davies. I work at the Washington State Department of Health. Today, I'm going to tell you about our Safer Products for Washington program and how we're identifying safer, feasible, and available alternatives to priority chemicals in priority products. This law is led by the Department of Ecology in consultation with the Department of Health. And I've listed some of the people who've been working on this. Safer Products for Washington is the implementation program for our 2019 law, the Pollution Prevention for Healthy People and the Puget Sound Act. And this act aims to reduce exposures to priority chemicals resulting from the use of consumer products. Our law has built on the California law that you just heard about, and we also have 4 phases. The first phase is where we identify priority chemical classes, because this law goes beyond individual chemicals, and we're looking at classes. Normally we have a year for this, but for the first round, the first set of priority chemical classes is in the law. Phase 2 is where we identify priority products that are significant source or use of these priority chemical classes. And this was a report to the legislature in June 2020. Now we're in phase 3, which is a 2-year phase where we determine regulatory actions. We can require notice for these priority chemicals and priority products or restrict them. And then phase 4 is ecology's rulemaking to implement any of those restrictions. So I'm not going to tell you right now about the 11 priority chemicals or products until the end, because I want to go through what we did to go through the methodology for how we're doing this. So the regulatory determinations, there's 3 choices. We can determine that no regulatory action is needed. We can require a manufacturer to provide notice, which is consistent with our Children's Safe Products Act, or we can restrict the use of the priority chemical class in the priority product. Thank you. And for a restriction, we have to show that safer alternatives are feasible and available, and that the restriction will either reduce the significant source or use of a priority chemical, or is necessary to protect the health of sensitive populations or sensitive species. Unlike in California, in Washington, it's the state agency that determines this. In the law mentions that safer is less hazardous, but doesn't give any other description of what it means to be less hazardous. It also doesn't define feasible and available. So first we had to figure out how we're going to create criteria for less hazardous, feasible, and available. We're not doing a full alternative assessment for each chemical. We're just identifying safe alternatives that are feasible and available. We're also not assessing all products, and the aim is not to come up with, a document that's helpful for users, but to identify these before we restrict the chemical in the priority product. So safer is defined in the law as less hazardous. It could include a chemical substitute, or it can be a change in the materials of design that eliminates the need for a chemical alternative. And we see safer as a spectrum, going from hazardous chemicals to, we have a minimum criteria and then additional criteria, and the goal is to push towards the optimal, the safest chemical. When we look at this, if we look at the priority chemical, if it doesn't meet our minimum criteria, so it's a hazardous chemical, then the safer alternative has to meet our minimum criteria. But if the priority chemical does meet our minimum criteria, then a safer alternative has to meet the additional criteria, kind of pushing along that spectrum. So you might think, well, that's good for one chemical, but how do we assess classes of chemicals? So for this, we looked to the National Academy of Sciences report on a class approach to the hazard assessment of organohalogen flame retardants. And within this report, there's 4 scenarios. The first scenario is much more simple. If there's all data-rich chemicals that agree, we would assess the class based on these data-rich chemicals. If the class consists of all data-poor chemicals, well, that's unlikely to be a priority chemical class if there's not a lot of data. In scenario 3, if there's both data-rich and data-poor chemicals, we assess the class based on the data-rich chemicals, and we assume the data-poor chemicals are also hazardous. The fourth scenario is the more complicated one. So if we have variable or discordant hazard data, so some members of the class meet our minimum criteria and other members of the class don't meet our minimum criteria, we have a few options. So for instance, we can look at which members of this chemical class are in the priority product that we're looking at and use those to assess the class. Or we could look, we could take, if some members don't meet the criteria, the minimum criteria, we can assess the whole class as potentially hazardous to be more conservative. So the minimum criteria we developed for SAFER, we're looking at chemicals that are used to function like priority products, priority chemicals. They can't have high concerns for carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, reproductive or developmental toxicity, or endocrine disruption. They also can't have high toxicity for other endpoints, such as systemic toxicity, and be very persistent and or very bioaccumulative. They also can't have very high persistence and very high bioaccumulation. So if you're familiar with different hazard assessment tools, you might recognize this as benchmark 1. So we've been using the green screen method of assessing chemical hazards. So the minimum criteria, if you meet the minimum criteria, then a chemical would be a benchmark 2 or higher. And we're using the green screen scoring system, which is based on EPA Safer Choice and GHS. These are some examples of certifications that meet our minimum criteria for SAFER. A lot of times companies don't want to give information to ecology or health on what's in their products and the hazards of them. So this allows information to go through a third party, such as Green Screen. As I mentioned, benchmarks 2, 3, and 4 would meet our minimum criteria, or the EPA Safer Chemical Ingredients List, chemicals that are evaluated against the master criteria. There's also products where we know the whole product meets our minimum criteria, such as the Green Screen certified gold and silver products, the EPA Safer Choice products, where the ingredients are evaluated against the master criteria, and also the Cradle to Cradle certified gold and platinum material health certificate products. Although for those, we may need additional documentation of persistence and bioaccumulation. So next we have to look at whether these safer alternatives are also feasible and available. As the law did not define feasible and available, we've looked to the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse Guide for Alternative Assessment. The IC2 is a group of state, local, and tribal governments that are whose goal is to encourage the use of safer alternatives. 2 of their modules are useful for this. We're using the performance module to look at technical feasibility, and the cost and availability module to look at cost and availability. The first question to look at feasibility is to define the function. Does the chemical act, the priority chemical act as a surfactant? Does it act as a conferring water resistance? What is the function? And then to ask, is the priority chemical necessary for this function? Is it possible to have this function with a different design or material so that the chemical is not necessary? So the main point in feasible and available is that if there's already a product that's available, that's used for the application of interest, then that safer alternative is feasible and available. If it's not already used, we would look at whether it could be used and is it offered for sale at a price that's close to the current. So these are our 11 priority products that we're looking at. We're looking at flame retardants in electronics and recreational polyurethane foam. We're looking at inadvertently generated PCBs in paints and printing inks. We're looking at PFAS in carpets and rugs, in leather and textile furnishings, and in the aftermarket stain and water resistant treatments for carpets and rugs and leather and textile furnishings. The law includes phenolic compounds. So we're looking at alkyl phenolphthalates in laundry detergent and bisphenols in thermal paper and food and drink can linings. And we're also looking at phthalates in flooring and personal care products. So our priority product report is up on Ecology's website. We're coming out in about a month with our draft report on regulatory determinations. So whether we found safer alternatives for these products and whether we need a restriction or a reporting notice. And if you're not already on our mailing list, or you want to be, you can contact me or someone else at Ecology to get put on the mailing list so that you get this report, because we really want to hear public comments, hear what people think. And finally, never sure if this is just a, there you go. I wanted to talk about challenges, kind of more of a big picture. So the goal of finding safe alternatives and encouraging the use to protect human health and the environment. A lot of the challenges we face, lack of information. Companies tend to treat what's in their product as confidential. and don't want to tell us or anybody else what's in it. There's also local differences. So waste disposal, fire codes, product usage, different communities use different products and they use them differently. We also see competing values, such as recycling and energy efficiency, that compete with toxics reduction. And then lastly, encouraging the use of safer alternatives is different from restricting the use of a priority chemical. People often ask us if companies are going to be required to use the safer alternatives that we identify. And no, they're not. We can ban a priority chemical and a priority product, but we can't make people use the safer alternatives we've identified. So in this little diagram, product 1 has red, which is the priority chemical here, and products 2 and 3 don't contain that priority chemical, but product 3 contains this purple one, which is another chemical of concern that we don't know is in product 3. So how do we move forward more into having people use safer alternatives is a different challenge. And with that, this is my contact information. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Holly. Again, if you have questions, you can feel free to add them to the chat or hold them for our panel discussion later on. And with that, we'll move on to the next presentation with Dolores Romano.
Yeah, hello?
Yep.
Okay.
There we are. Great.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this conference. And okay, I'll just go straight forward to present very briefly. First, the substitution framework or policy framework in the EU. There is a lot of pieces of policy of regulations that are enhancing substitution. Very briefly, we have a directive for the protection of workers from the risk posed by carcinogens and mutagens that mandates substitution whenever technically feasible alternatives are available. The assessment of the availability of alternatives, however, is done at the plant level, at company level, and it's up to the OSH inspections to see if this is enforced. So it's really very complex, and well, it's up to the company, and the inspectors really don't have the knowledge on alternatives that are available. So well, it's difficult to assess how well this has gone so far. Then for biocides and pesticides, there is what we have is an authorization process. You cannot place a biocide or a pesticide in the EU market if it has not been authorized. And in this authorization process, there's also an alternatives assessment, but this is done at a EU wide basis. So there's an assessment for pesticides by the Agency on Food Security. For biocides, it's another agency, ECA, the Chemicals Agency. Then it's a decision from the European Commission, and there's also votes from member states. So this is for the whole EU. For all EU countries will have to comply with this. There's a different also way of promoting substitution. This has to do with ROS. Perhaps you're more familiar. This is a restriction of hazardous substances in electric and electronic products. And here, when chemicals are nominated or included for restriction, there is a possibility for companies to ask for a derogation. And these derogations, including the analysis of alternatives, this is done by an external consultancy that informs the decision from the Commission. And then we have REACH and two processes, authorization and restriction, which I will explain a bit in more detail today. So, well, this is a graphic from the European Chemicals Agency. I just wanted to really tell you that it has 3 steps. First, very similar to what we have seen in California and also in Washington. First, you have the identification of what we call here the substances of very high concern. We call it this the candidate list. So substances that are included here will have information requirements, for example, throughout the supply chain. A manufacturer will have to, and all the supply will have to inform the whole supply chain that this chemical is present in any product or mixture. And from this list, there is a prioritization to which substances end up in Annex 14. So there is a recommendation by ECHA, but the final decision, again, this is from the Commission. And for these chemicals, so from this group of chemicals, there's a smaller group that require companies that want to continue using these chemicals, they have to ask for an authorization. So they have to apply, and their application will be reviewed by the RAC and the SEAC committees, and there will be a final decision from the Commission. So as you see, the 4 process can take almost 5 years. There are, to make this a bit more complex even, there are 2 routes. So if the chemical is considered a threshold chemical, the decision is based on risk, not on the availability of alternatives. So if the risk is controlled, they may be granted authorization to continue using it. But for non-threshold chemicals, mutagens, carcinogens, the decision is mainly based on the availability of alternatives. So here it's a much more, it plays a much more important role, of course. So the application, when a company wants to continue using these chemicals, they have to submit an application for authorization. And this includes an analysis of alternatives. So it's the applicant who wants to continue using a chemical who has to analyze the alternatives. There is a public consultation to allow third parties to submit information on alternatives, make comments to this assessment of alternatives that the applicants have submitted. And then the committees at ECHA will give their opinion. This opinion will inform the Commission's decision. So the SEAC, what they look, if the alternatives that have been highlighted by the applicant or through the public consultation, they have to give their opinion if they are suitable, if they are technically and economically suitable. And so far, they have been doing this looking only at the applicant's perspective. I say so far because I will tell you later that things are changing now. And if RAC considers that there are some suitable alternatives, sorry, if SEAC considers that there are suitable alternatives, then RAC will look at the assessment of the risk. So what they actually would do is a very superficial hazard assessment and compare the alternative, if it has a classification, a harmonized classification, or if it's also included in the candidate list, but there's no in-depth analysis of hazards or risks. Here's some figures. There are already 219 substances. Well, not substances, these are entries in the candidate list. And I say entries because some of the entries are groups. So I don't know the exact figure, but it's over 380 chemicals that are included in the candidate list. But in the authorization list, the list where companies have to submit an application. There are 54, and so far, well, AFAs have been submitted for 30 substances. So some critiques from our side is that SEAC has not given any negative opinion based on the analysis of alternatives. If they have doubts or there are a lot of uncertainties if there are suitable alternatives or not, what they say, if they give a positive opinion and they just recommend a shorter review period. This review period is that applicants can be granted an authorization for a specific time, like for 5 years, for 7 years. And in this when the 7 years approach, if they have not submitted another application, then they cannot continue using it. But if they submit, they can continue, they can renew like their application. So it's like when it's not clear, the availability of alternatives, it's not clear what SEAC normally does, and the commission is that they say, okay, you have to submit your review report, or you have to resubmit sooner. More critics from our side is that applicants tend to include very specific, very high technical requirements. So it's very difficult to find an alternative. I'll give you an example soon. The economic assessment over rely on costs. There's very poor assessments on benefits for substitution, or even there's no inclusion of the impacts that granting an authorization can have on alternative providers. Perhaps you have invested in a new process, in a new product, because you have seen that this chemical is hazardous, is a very high concern. And then if this authorization is granted, you are really impacting these front runners. But this is not taken into account at all right now. So the case I wanted to tell you is that Sweden brought the commission in front of the court because the commission granted authorization to the representative, a Canadian company, to continue marketing lead chromate paints in the EU. All EU producers of paints have for years already phased out the use of lead and of chromium in paints. They are not marketed in the EU by any EU company, so it's all imports. So they were asking for authorization to use white and yellow pigments for road marking, paintings, machinery, plastics. And the way they described their use, their technical function was that the level of brightness of the white and the yellow was indispensable for security reasons, for the road markings, for the security of the plastics used for special uses for machinery. They really need this special yellow brightness or white brightness that only the chromium, the lead would give. So Sweden denounced the commission, brought them in front of the court, basically because no roads in Sweden are painted with chromium or with lead, and they said, okay, if we can do it, why can't the others? But this is just there was they really wanted to clarify well how the opinions were being taken, how the decisions on authorization were being taken. And the ruling, what it said is very important, because this is now changing what will happen now with how you assess alternatives. So first they said that a certain loss of technical performance of alternatives is acceptable. In this case, you can lose a bit of brightness in the yellow and you can continue serving your safety function for the road markings, for example. Then they say that it is mandatory to submit a substitution plan when alternatives are available in general. So, for example, there are many other paints that European companies submitted, like a whole dossiers through the public consultation with all the paints they had in their portfolio, showing that there were alternatives for all these uses. So then, okay, if there are alternatives in general, then the applicant has to submit a substitution plan. Then it also said that it's only that the alternatives assessment has also to look at what is suitable for the downstream users, not only for the applicant. So the applicant may be, like in this case, a company, an importer of paints, but the final downstream user also, you also have to see if the alternatives are acceptable for the company that's using it in the final stage. And very important, that's why I put it in bold, it's because SEAC role until now, how ECA and the Commission had interpreted ECA role was to actually go into assessing the suitability of the alternatives. And the court says that this is not the role, that the role of this committee is to assess the credibility of the application, the credibility of the alternatives assessment, and the credibility of the substitution plan. So what they have to see if the applicant has made their case and if they have demonstrated that alternatives are not available. So here a bit more on figures, very, very fast. This is from ECA's report on the operation of REACH and CLP. I have here a link. It's a very interesting report by ECA. And just to show you that for the 43 Annex 14 entries with a human health endpoint, half of them there was no submission of AFAs, of applications for authorization. There are six went to bridging applications. This is just they were in the phasing out the use and just needed some time for the final phase out. For example, HBCD needed some, I don't remember how many years at the end, if it was 2 or 4 years. So it shows that well, in big figures, the process is working. Also interesting from this report from MECA, they are seeing that the companies that so far have resubmitted application after this, the time ended after the review report time, there is a high decrease in the volume used. So they are seeing that the volume of chemicals that have been applied to continue using has been reduced in 95%. So this is also a real benefit of the process. No? They also look, they made a report asking companies when they started to substitute, and from, you see, well, we have a prephase, like it's risk management option analysis where you screen substances and say, okay, this should go through authorization, this should go to restriction. This is the first stage, but you see that once they are included in the candidate list, in the Annex 14 list, this is just being listed is when it is when most companies decide to substitute, and really the last phase when application for authorization is not. So substitution is triggered by the inclusion of the substances in these lists. So fast restriction is a different process because this is the member states. Well, you can restrict manufacturing, using, or placing in the market. Substances are their own or in mixtures. And you have to, and this happens when there is a risk that has to be addressed on a community-wide basis. This is a risk that has to be addressed in the whole EU, for the whole, all the countries. This is different because instead of an applicant, it's national authorities, national agencies, ministries, or ECA who prepare a proposal, a restriction proposal. And again, the RAC and SEA committees inform with their opinions the final decision from COM. And here, it's the member state who has to prepare an alternatives assessment. And this alternatives assessment will inform the scope, the final scope of the restriction. So if there will be derogations or not, which derogations, or if they propose a transitional period. So you are not, the restriction will not enter into force until 5 years, 7 years, to allow for these alternatives to be fully developed or fully available in the market. The alternatives assessment is not like thrilling. It's mainly a list available options. It depends on the dossier. Some are more in depth, some are less. So our critiques from NGOs is that so far the Commission has decided to derogate uses when there are uncertainties about the availability of alternatives, and this should not. We believe that at most there should be a longer transitional period, but not a derogation. We also are very critical with SEAC because we believe they tend to accept industry claims at face value with very poor justifications. So the situation is improving, but at the beginning, industry will ask for what we call the Christmas a gift list, and with all the derogations they wanted, and due to the lack of the capacity of the committee to assess if really these derogations were needed, if the alternatives were really not available, well, they will say, okay, we derogate. So from our point of view, if you don't know, and if it has not been fully justified, then you should ban. It's a precautionary approach instead of the way around. And so far, also, this situation is changing. The EU is restricting, has been restricting what we call dead chemicals in the EU. So what the restrictions were really trying to stop imports, mainly from chemicals that were not anymore manufactured in the EU. So just my final slide is what's happening now. We are in a quite exciting phase in the EU because the new Commission has launched its Green Deal and a chemical strategy for sustainability, with the aim of a non-toxic environment. So the final aim is a non-toxic environment, and there are several concepts and aims, objectives. For example, the extension of what we call here in Europe the general risk approach to ban substances of concern in consumer and professional uses. So this means that you do not have to perform a risk assessment or alternatives assessment by chemical and by use, but for example, for toys, carcinogens, all carcinogens are banned in toys. So what this would be extended to all substances of concern in all consumer products without going into any detailed risk assessment. The aim also of the strategy is to promote a group approach to regulating chemicals, The essential use concept will be introduced. It's still not clear. They are developing it inspired in the Montreal Protocol. For us, the best way to use it is to ban all non-essential uses. And then they're also developing a new concept of safe and sustainable by design. And well, we are looking forward to, well, we are participating in this, and let's see how it's finally applied. And just to finish, we are in the middle of revising REACH. It has never been open since it was approved back in 2007. So the aim is to try to improve the process, make it less burdensome and more effective. So I leave it here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dolores. And to all our presenters so far, there's a lot going on, a lot to unpack. So we're going to move into a second half of our session with a panel discussion and incorporate some audience Q&A as well. We have a couple of questions in the chat already. But before we get into that, I'm going to introduce again our additional discussants to our panel. Paul Ashford, a Managing Director from Anthesis Collab, and Mark Rossi, Executive Director of Clean Production Action. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to give them a moment to add some of their reflections to the presentation so far, and then we'll move into the discussion. So why don't we, since we were in the EU in our last presentations, why don't we start with Paul, if you have any thoughts and reflections that you'd like to add.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me just come on video. Yes, thanks very much for the opportunity, and thanks to the three presenters for their presentations. I think they've highlighted some of the challenges within the whole alternative assessment approach and where it fits within a regulatory framework. And the challenge always is putting that in somewhere where it can be effective. I need to be careful not to steal my own thunder from the next session, because I'm talking on the chemical strategy for sustainability then. So I'm not going to really try and comment too much at this moment in time on the future in the EU. But I think what we've heard is indicative of the challenge. My own personal background is one within the Montreal Protocol, where we were actually looking at a very select group of chemicals, namely the ozone depleting substances, and looking at substitution strategies from that perspective. And that was a fairly successful alternative assessment process and substitution strategy development. And it was very collegiate. It involved a lot of stakeholders at a fairly early stage. And one of the challenges I think that there is in regulatory structures is inevitably regulatory structures have to be very well defined. And sometimes the discussions need to be a little bit more versatile and flexible than the regulatory structure allows. It also dictates, I think, at which point various stakeholders can get involved. So just to pick up on an example from Dolores's presentation, although an alternative, a manufacturer of an alternative can enter into the discussion about alternative assessment under an authorization request from a particular applicant, they can only do it very late in the process after the alternative assessment is written. And they only have 45 days to do that. So they have to prepare and get ready in advance, not knowing what the alternative assessment necessarily says. And of course, the issue there is that, and I think this is true in pretty well all the examples we've heard about in various ways, is that we are asking the applicant who has an interest, who is obviously, because they're going through the process, has an interest in retaining the incumbent chemical. We're asking them to write the alternative assessment, which inevitably is going to conclude that that there are no alternatives available. So I think where thinking is going in this space is that we need to get the alternative assessment process very much earlier in the process and more inclusive. If you're going to, and I think where the EU may be going now is towards a one which is triggered not so much by risk, but more by identifying the hazard in the chemical in the first instance, and also the use patterns and exposures that might lead to problems that that need to be addressed. So that's going to be one of the things I think that may come out of the CSS process. But at this moment in time, I think it's fair to say that the regulatory structures are not really designed for a holistic alternative assessment approach. And I think, it's no criticism of the regulators, it's a really complex task to try and regulate. But I think that's a factor. And as I think most of you who frequent some of the regular calls, one of the concerns I have broadly is that we have the fox in charge of the hen house in many ways at this moment in time in some of the processes we have. And that's, again, no criticism of some of the more progressive industry groups and some of those who are very much more collegiate, but there is a sense in which the processes are in the wrong place. And that's often because the cost of doing an alternative assessment is really significant. And therefore, I think regulators are uncomfortable to take that on. And inevitably, those that will take it on are those that want to defend the process. So I'm thinking about much more holistic and globalized type approaches where you do it well and do it once, with some consistency of data and some consistency of use. And I'm also, the other only concern I have in the whole process is that a lot of times, because alternative assessment is late in the process and it's expensive, means that a lot of companies who use the substance will drop out or try and avoid going through an authorization process and substitute. And we have no visibility about what those substitutes are. So the potential for regrettable substitutions in that space is quite high. So I think those are sort of the general comments I'd like to reflect on, just having heard what we've heard, and also just from a perspective of having been in the space for a while.
Great, thank you for that, Paul. Mark, did you have any comments, reflections?
Yes, thank you, Kathy. And just thank you to Xiaoying, Holly, and Dolores for excellent presentations. And I do want to highlight, right, that first, right, those presentations represent significant progress to safer alternatives. You know, you've got this growing movement of, right, hazard-based and hazard-informed decision-making around the elimination of chemicals of concern, which is a significant change. You've got focus on chemical classes, which is also a significant change. And also you have a focus on large groups of chemicals like the EU candidate list, and you've got the priority chemical list in California, and Washington State has its very large list. So there's significant progress, you know, that has been made. I want to touch on, you know, how you put up like the goal that for Washington State. And so the goal that I see is, right, we want to rapidly eliminate chemicals of concern and replace them with safer alternatives. And so a key part of this is rapid. Right, because the pace that we're moving at, we're not going to be solving this problem in the next generation. So, and this is, and the timelines that were put up on what we're already doing, they just highlight that we need to accelerate the pace at which we're eliminating these chemicals of concern. So time is one of those challenges. You know, just some of been my challenges as lack of transparency, complexity, alternatives not necessarily safer in time. So 4 big challenges, and then thinking of a policy framework, like how do you solve that? You do need, like what Paul is saying, like a holistic framework, right? The EU chemical strategy starts to get at this, but I think, right, addressing all of these challenges is really hard to do, right, through one policy vehicle. And so I just want to point out, right, you could have like different policy vehicles. So transparency is a huge issue, because how do you know the alternative is safer if you don't know what's in it, right? And so we need more chemical ingredient disclosure. It needs to be more publicly available, more, and that is going to have to be legally required, because companies are not going to voluntarily disclose the chemicals in their products publicly, right? So we need more public disclosure of chemicals in the products. We need these lists of big lists of chemicals of concern. So once you have your target chemical, PFAS, methylene chloride, the alternatives must not have any of these large lists of chemicals in them, right? You can't have a California candidate chemical in there. It's over whatever, thousands of chemicals. So one part of this is that the alternatives must not have any of these known problematic chemicals. And then the third part is then on the alternatives and them being safer. So first of all, right, we have to have the alternatives. So we do need the investment in research and development of new, safer, greener chemicals, materials, right? So that is like, you need that baseline investment. You need the work in the methodological space. And Holly did a really nice framing of how to really think about structures for evaluating safer chemicals, but you need the methodological requirements. And then once you have those, the more that we can have positive lists of chemicals that meet the green screen benchmark 2 or higher, right, is huge, because then you want to create designers with the palette of chemicals to choose from. And we also then need procurement to buy certified safer products. So you need to embed this in certification. So you need these multi-pronged approaches. But I think like in the space of what we were just talking about, right, these big lists of chemicals of concern, those chemicals can't be in the alternatives. We need the methodological requirements. And then we need to really get into the business of identifying the positive, right, what we want. So great presentations. Look forward to the conversation. Glad to be here with you today.
Great, thanks. Yeah, like I said, there's a lot to unpack and there's a lot of complexity here. So I think with that, we'll bring back our presenters to add to the panel, and we'll get into some discussion and of course get into some of the questions from our audience. So we'll welcome back Holly Davies, Dolores Romano, and Xiaoying Zhou. Great, hello, welcome back. So, okay, so now with our last few minutes here, I think we'll start off with a question. I think this is covered in one of the first audience questions that came up during Xiaoying's presentation, because sort of overlaps what I was planning to send out to the panelists to kick us off. So that first question would be, what are your, say, 1 to 3 policy provisions that you think are critical to moving to safer chemistry? And I think, again, we talked about this in your presentations, but I think it would be great to have you highlight those a little more strongly. So why don't we start with Xiaoying, our first presenter?
Yeah, I would say the first, since we said the transparency is the foundation for the best AA practice, I would think we should mandate the transparency and disclosure to fill some data gaps. So at least to provide product and the alternative, the ingredients, the chemicals identities, and also the hazard profiles of the chemical of concern and the potential alternatives. And even nicer to ask them to disclose the production and consumption volume of those chemical of concern in their products and release to the environment. And the second one, I would see at least to incorporate the set of the minimum requirement of the criteria to define what is safer, like the one incorporated in the OECD AA guidance released earlier this year, and also to incorporate some additional considerations of the exposure and life cycle thinking. In that way, you can avoid a lot of the regrettable substitution issues and avoid the burden shifting from one media to another, from one life stage to another. And kind of provide a holistic, comprehensive assessment. Another one I would think is to provide greater clarity on the authority and strong enforcement. And so the agency can have the authority really to oversee and ensure the implementation. And so it kind of provide the driver, and also maybe provide some mechanism to award those leaders in the industry. And so you kind of have the drivers and incentive to really kind of promote that adoption. So that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Great. No, thank you. Holly, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so to build on Zhao's transparency, what we really need is the EPA to be able to require a minimum data set, and to build that data set through NAMs. We're not using so many animals, because then we'd not only know what's being used, but we'd be able to actually look at the hazard of all the chemicals. States, local governments, tribes can do what Washington and California have done with laws similar to ours, or even just wait for us to do the work and then ban the same chemicals that we're banning to move the industry. And the last thing I was going to mention was being able to give money to people who are developing safer alternatives, and then tax the people who are making products with hazardous chemicals, kind of to do both the carrot and the stick. Thanks.
No, that's a really good, it's a really good point to bring up, is that these are complex assessments and they need funding and support in order to do them. So how do we incorporate mechanisms to help make that a reality? It's very important. Dolores, did you have any policy provisions that you think can get us to safer chemistry?
Well, I have to agree with Holly and Xiaoying. It's the transparency is key. When I was thinking about this, of course, transparency. So I won't expand on this, but at least in EU, what at the end of the day, what really drives is regulation, is restriction, is phasing out, and phasing out of groups. So for I have a lot of white hair, and for the last years we have been thinking about all these incentives, drivers. And at the end of the day, industry only reacts to regulation. It's so sad, like this. So this is the main incentives for substitution, has been in the last 30 years, and so far it's like that. And I would also like to add on the fees. We really love the Massachusetts Toxic Fuels Reduction Act. And we are now thinking how we could implement something like that in the REACH revision, because I don't know if there has been a better model ever in the world. Thank you.
Great. Paula, did you have any comments on the policy provisions?
Yeah, I pick up on Holly's point a little bit, which is something I've been arguing about for a long time, which is, firstly, global data sharing agreements. There's quite a lot of hazard data around, and it seems silly that that's not readily available around. I know there are some elements of it which are on the ECHA database and people can borrow from, but the risk of that is that sometimes you don't see what's behind it. And and also those dossiers they're live documents. So I think there should be a way of being able to share those. And in all honesty, I think in this alternative assessment space, we're lacking a little bit of global leadership. What I'd like to see would be perhaps more activity from SAPA and those types of organizations. And one of the areas I think that they can contribute on is to have some more thinking about putting focus on some sort of standardization of alternative assessment methodology. And I think that's where A4 actually has quite a significant potential role to actually help in characterizing, at least characterizing what's already around there. Because one of the challenges I think we have is that if you go to different parts of the world, you'll have very different alternative assessment methodologies. And that to some extent I think is counterproductive, because a lot of industry actually is multinational, and they would prefer to have some consistency about what they can and cannot use in different areas. So some alignment on that would be fine. And then the other thing, which is I think ties into the transparency point, is that I think we're increasingly got capabilities in digital data transmission to actually really upgrade supply chains in a meaningful way, not necessarily to be able to have to disclose everything, but to make the data available and accessible rather than lost, which is often the case at the moment. So having a way of at least being able to track it, I think would be a really important further point. So those are my few thoughts on the agenda.
Thanks. And Mark, did you want to?
Yeah, just
add
I
in?
mean, I would echo all the points, so I won't restate what others have stated. But I would just, the one part that I would add in, right, we want these hazard databases to then be applied to get to positive lists of chemicals, and ensuring that you have, right, as part of those positive lists, you have all the data gaps filled. And so, for example, in endocrine activity, right, that's been a real challenge that we don't have that endpoint filled in. So let's get the hazard data all combined to use that to identify lists of chemicals that we want companies to be using.
Great, thank you. Well, there's lots of questions coming into the chat, and I think it would be a great time to move towards audience Q&A. Since we only have a few minutes left. So I'll start in the chat, and if anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and turn your video on and engage that way. And you're not limited to the chat box. So we'll start early on here. The question, there was some question about, again, the policy changes. I think we already talked about that. There was a question about whether the California reports are available to the public, and I think that has been responded to in the chat box. So if you're interested in that, see the links that are available there. There's also a subscription to what's going on in the Washington Rail for Safer Products for Washington, a link to subscribe to the listserv. We did have a question from Pamela Eliason for Holly. She said, a great presentation, thank you. I wonder if you can elaborate on whether you've seen recycling or energy efficiency compete with, and I assume limit, finding safer alternatives.
Hi, thanks, Pam. So that challenges is supposed to be more broad. So we haven't seen that in this round of Safer Products for Washington. But I was thinking about things like energy efficiency, where there might be requirements for blanking on the insulation with certain flame retardants. So there we have the issue of wanting energy efficiency versus not wanting the hazardous flame retardants. Or tires, which are not one of our priority products, but tires have so many hazardous chemicals in them. And yet we have like 1 tire per person per year to dispose of, so it's just millions of tires. And yet wanting to recycle them ends up being an issue. So thanks.
Great. I think that brings up an interesting idea about end of life and how to incorporate that into alternative assessment and how that plays into the decision process and the assessment process. Did anyone in the panel have any perspectives on that?
Yeah, I could just pick it up in the context of the chemical strategy for sustainability, because what's interesting about that is it's actually coming out of the European Green Deal. So it's coming out of a sustainability framework. And one of the major pillars of that framework is actually the Circular Economy Action Plan. So part of this whole connection is really thinking about how do we make it that chemicals are not a barrier effectively to circularity. So I think we're beginning to see a bit more connection in that way, because obviously once you start talking about a circular economy, while you can define the use in the first cycle, you can't necessarily define the use in subsequent cycles, which then obviously takes away a little bit of the exposure argument to risk assess rather than, or to risk characterize, rather than to actually reduce hazard where you can. So I think we're seeing some institutionalizing, if that's not the wrong word, but some sort of building in of that line of thinking within the wider holistic perspective. So yeah, I think it's a really important element. Even in our own organization here, we end up with whereas as sustainable chemistry people, we're sat within our sustainable products group for exactly that reason, because the interplay between the chemistry and the products is so close and so important if you're thinking about wider circularity. So that's just a few thoughts from my side.
I was wondering, Xiaoying, if you had any comments, as California has a life cycle focus in their framework, and if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I would also add, like, transparency may also play a role here, because we want the manufacturers companies really to fully communicate what comes with those products. It's not only energy efficiency, recycling is a concern, but it's also those toxicity and those exposure could also become a concern. So once you have that, the big picture, and to present it to the key stakeholders, we want the public and the key stakeholder to weigh in and to also be part of that, so we can decide what's a final specific regulatory response to impose to certain product. Because I also believe for the different product and sectors, that's going to be the different, what is more important. And so that will also play a role here.
Great. In the chat, we also had some question about in the REACH authorization in CLP about who is actually defined as downstream user. And I think that's a really interesting question regarding stakeholders and just identifying and categorizing who's who. There was a follow-up in the response about defining, they said within the EU area who uses the substance either on its own or in the mixture and in their industrial or professional activities. And there is a link and further clarification, that's not usually the consumer. So I think that's interesting. I do want to move on a little bit, make sure I get to all these questions. Another audience question we had is, applying for an authorization now a lower effort alternative for a manufacturer of a restricted substance than alleging a technical barrier to trade through the WTO? I'm not sure I quite understand that question. Let me read that again. So is applying for an authorization now a lower effort alternative for a manufacturer of a restricted substance than alleging a technical barrier to trade through the WTO? So perhaps Dolores can comment on that one.
Well, I'm not too familiar with, well, not familiar at all with the WTO process, but for applications for authorization, they have to be for specific uses, for a chemical for a very specific use. So if I'm not sure if the WTO, you can go like that for something so specific for a specific plant. It's not a use in many plants. It has to be for one company. You have to say where you are going to use it. And I don't know if that would be, I don't know, basically. I think perhaps it's easier if until now, if you have a good case that you can prove that you have minimized the risk, you can prove that you have proved that no alternatives are available, then your application will go through. Hopefully in the near future with the REACH revision and now with the new changes after the ruling of the court, it will not be so easy, but so far it has been very easy to get an authorization. And sorry, Kathy, just to build in on the previous discussion on the life cycle, one of the aims of the REACH revision that the Commission wants to do is that in the registration dossiers, you know, companies have to submit information about hazards and exposure for substances above 1 ton. They want to change the information requirements to include other information, other environmental information, for example, the energy footprint. So this is this also to contribute to this wider discussion about the impacts of the chemicals, not only the toxicity.
Great.
If I could just comment, Kathy, on the WTO question. I think the answer to that question is neither is very easy. I accept Dolores's point that it's that the success rate with authorizations is too high, but actually the actual exercise of bringing the information together to support an authorized application for authorization is significant. So, and often that's why companies come together in a use group and actually do that as a joint exercise rather than as individual companies. But but obviously the WTO one is a really much harder one, I think, to argue in terms, and it's in the end it's a legal question rather than anything else in terms of is the EU introducing a barrier to trade, which it shouldn't be. And that's where you get into that sort of technical barrier discussion. But neither of them is particularly easy. And although I do agree with Dolores that the success rate for applications for authorization is too high at this point in time for all the reasons that she's explained very well.
Great, thanks. So we have just 3 minutes left in our panel discussion, and I think we'll close it off with the final question from Joel. I think would be a great closer. Can the speakers talk more about how to reorient chemical restriction A policy processes so that we don't get caught up in paralysis by analysis, as the case with the chemical by chemical risk-based approach, while supporting thoughtful assessment as well as stimulating and supporting the transition to safer chemicals?
I'll jump in on that quickly, and then so my colleagues can also weigh in our short bit of time. But I think the first part is you have to eliminate the known chemicals of concern, right? We've got thousands of known chemicals of concern. The priority should be, phase those out by 2030, and then you say to companies, you have to find alternatives that meet a methodological requirement, and then they demonstrate that they're going to meet that methodological requirement. Because otherwise, it's just going to go on forever, and as we discussed a bit here. But I think you have to accelerate the timeline, as Dolores was saying, for restriction, and create the criteria by which you define safer, and then you have the companies demonstrate that they're meeting those requirements for safer.
Yeah, so I would say we're trying to do this by looking at classes of chemicals in a thoughtful way. Our 5-year cycle seems really, really fast to us, fast as we can do it in a thoughtful way to hit our deadlines, and also get input from stakeholders about what we're doing. And the other thing, as I said before, if we started taxing products and hazardous chemicals, I think that would also speed up the change to safer alternatives.
Great. Xiaoying, did you have any comments?
Yeah, I also add on that California also has kind of the proposed legislation and want to do some like fast track, if like by leverage the other state agencies or national resource, if there's proven like safer and feasible alternatives on the market, so you can kind of skip the AA process and to directly and take some class approach or the approach to switch to safer alternatives. So that may be one of the options.
Great. Dolores.
Yeah, well, I agree with the group approach, as we call it here, or the restricting by classes. This is key to avoid also regrettable substitution and to speed up. And then we are thinking about ways to build in incentives for companies that have alternatives to be able to provide this information in an early stage, as Paul was saying, and also incentives for companies to submit their information. I don't know if you are aware that the registration database of ECA is mainly, it has very poor data, mainly non-compliance 70% of the of the dossiers that ECA looks at every year are non-compliant, so you cannot rely. So we need to build incentives for companies to give in a reliable information, and these incentives can be fees, can be sending them to authorization process if they do not submit the information in a restriction process, for example. We have had enough of 10 years of carrots with REACH, and now I believe we need a bit of a stick for a couple of years at least.
Paul, go ahead.
It's all right. Yeah, probably not a lot to add to what's been said, although there's a very interesting discussion going on at the moment in the polymer space, actually, as we look to register certain polymers as to whether the grouping should be done by chemistry or by hazard. And there is a sense in which you can combine hazard and use, and you have the same basic issue that you're dealing with. And actually, you can be quicker in your regulatory approach to that. As long as you have enough hazard data, which brings us exactly back to Dolores's point that you need to have consistent and good data, which sort of brings me back to my point, which is that global sharing of data would be really helpful.
I am a technical person and I love data. So if we can get more data that and share it and get it consistent, that sounds like a great plan to me. So with that, thank you so much to our panelists and our presenters. Really liked the conversation today. And in the engagement from the audience, thank you for your questions. We really appreciate you attending. We're going to take a half-hour break now before we move into the afternoon, or I should say our next session. Session 4, Alternative Assessment and Informed Substitution, Part 2, Lessons Learned for More Effective Implementation. Really looking forward to this, and we're going to continue the conversation. So I hope to see you back in 30 minutes. And with that, I would like to thank our sponsors for their generosity and helping us organize and host this event. So thank you again for your support, and we'll see you back in 30 minutes.